Bore da I bawb. It being St David's Day, Dydd Gwyl Dewi. Croeso I Gaerdydd. Welcome to Cardiff. Our first witness is a visitor, so very nice to see you.
Thank you.
Now, before we start, can I just make a few announcements about today, which may be a bit more flexible than we normally are. What we hope to do is to have 2 witnesses this morning give oral evidence. If time permits this morning, we will also then read in some summaries of witness statements, which will take us up to about 1 o'clock. If that summary reading does take place this morning, we won't start it after about 20 to 1, but if we finish the witnesses by about then, we will then do some reading. This afternoon, there's 1 oral witness. Very unfortunately, after that witness finishes, I have to have a break to have a meeting about an unrelated matter. And then if there are any further statements to be read, they will be done after my meeting, so around about 3:45. So I'm sorry there's a bit more uncertainty than usual, but I'm sure we'll cope. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Our first witness today is Mrs. Wendy Buffery.
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly,
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
As I think you know, my name's Ruth Kennedy and I ask questions on behalf of the inquiry. Could you confirm your full name for the inquiry, please?
Wendy Vivian Buffery.
And I think you have a copy of your statement there.
I do.
It should be dated the 14th of January.
It is.
And it's 11 pages. Is that right?
That's correct.
And if you look at the last page, is that your signature there?
It is, yes.
And have you read through this statement recently?
I have, yes.
Is it true to the best of your knowledge?
To the best of my knowledge, yes.
I'm going to start by asking a couple of introductory questions about you. How old are you now?
62.
And you live with your husband, is that right?
I do, yes.
How long have you been married?
44, coming up to 45 years.
What jobs did you do before working for the post office?
Quite a varied thing, working in retail. Then I worked as a rep for a retail company for Johnson's Wax. I've worked for the ambulance service and for St John's as a volunteer.
Why did you want to become a sub-postmistress?
I've been repping for 10 years, and computers came in, and it wasn't the same. We used to go to different shops, cash and carriers, etc., and take their orders for products and show new products, etc. And now that all could be done via computer. So I decided that I needed to look for something that was more conducive to staying at home, because I was staying away from home a lot with that. And a friend of mine ran a post office, and she said, would you like to come and try? So I went to her post office and I she trained me up a little bit, and then I used to do Saturdays for her after I'd finished working where I was, and I loved it. It was great, you know, I'm a people person, so it was really nice to have people coming, chatting, you know, it was great. And I did that for 3 or 4 months, and then said to my husband, yeah, I think this would be the way to go, because I really enjoy it. So then we started looking at different post offices in the area. Some of them had accommodation, some of them didn't. And then a Patherley post office came onto the market. So we went and had a look at that and decided that was the one for us.
Why did you think it was the one for you?
It was a detached property. The post office took up the front half of the ground floor. Behind it, we had a lovely big front room and kitchen and things, and a lovely garden at the back. Well, it was lovely once we got at it. And it was, although the shop was there, it was still a very peaceful place to be. And the people in the local area were really nice.
I think, is it Up Hatherley Post Office?
It
that how you
is,
say it?
yes, yeah.
And I think you say in your statement you took over as sub postmistress in March 1999. Is that about right?
Yeah. I was interviewed for it in 98. And then with trying to sell our shop, our house to buy it, and the outgoing sub postmistress was also in a chain to buy. It was March of 99 before we actually moved in.
And where in the country was that post office? Just broad?
Cheltenham. It's in a suburb of Cheltenham.
How many staff did you employ at your post office?
I employed 4 part-timers in the shop. They all did different hours to make sure we were all covered. And I employed 3 people in the post office, 2 of them which did full-time but sort of overlapped, so we were still covered on a Saturday, and 1 that did the busiest times of the week.
How busy was your post office?
When I took over it, it was, well, the salary was about 26,000 when we first took over it. But I worked very hard to build that up. We put a new counter and everything in and made it 4 counters. And I got it up to about 65,000 by the time I was exited.
What training did you receive when you took over as sub postmistress?
I had the training with my friend, but when I took over the sub postmistress, it was still paper-based. I went to, I think it was, Yate or somewhere like that, to go and have a day's training with all the different paperwork, which forms were for what, how to fill them in, how to sell different products. And then the day we moved in, I took over the post office, so we were moving everything in, and I'm trying to learn what's happening with the post office I was going to run. And I had a trainer that was supposed to be with me for 2 weeks, and after the first week he said I was fine, and he just came back for the balance the second week, and that was it.
When was Horizon introduced in your branch? Do you remember?
I can't remember the exact date, but I think it was between 2001, 2002, but I'm not sure of the actual date it was.
What training did you receive on Horizon?
We went to a local hotel with a load of other sub-postmasters from the area, because there was a lot of us that were going live at the same time. There was... Yeah, I went for a day with one of my staff, leaving the 2 to cover the post office, and then the next day they went. But it wasn't even really a full day's training. So by the time we got there, done a little bit of how to sell a stamp on the screen, and then stopped for lunch. It was about 4 hours training in total. And we did a little bit on a balance, but it wasn't, you were showed how to put the stamps in, the stock in, the cash in, but they didn't tell you what to do if it wasn't right. So we used to have a little magazine come through called Counter News every week, and we sort of gleaned most of our training from that. We didn't have any. I've heard some of the others say that they had instruction books that they had. We didn't have anything like that.
How did you find using Horizon?
I thought it was quite good. It certainly made my life easier to begin with. You know, it just got so that when the shortcomings did start coming, it was more difficult to find, because in the old days when we just had paper and you could literally look down and see where any discrepancy was. Or you go and have a cup of coffee and come back and look at it with new eyes and you go, that's what it is. And you'd sort it out straight away. But with Horizon, you didn't have that ability.
What shortfalls or discrepancies did you start to notice on the system?
I didn't have a lot of little shortfalls. It seemed to be all or nothing with mine. The first one I had was over, I can't remember the exact amount, but I put it into, because we still had the ability to put it into a suspense account then. And then when it had been there long enough that they said, you know, you've got to pay this off, it came out of my wages.
Is that, I think, following an audit in around 2004? Would that be about right?
No.
This was before?
No, this was a different one during the time. One audit I had, and I was over £1,000 down, but one of my staff disappeared off to Greece for a while, and I've not seen her since, so I think I paid for her holiday, because I was held responsible for that. I was suspended and held responsible for that, and if it hadn't been for her actually ringing the management of the post office to see if she was under any suspicion, they wouldn't have come back to me and said that's a very odd thing for somebody to do. And, you know, so you can go back to work as long as you make good the amount. So I did.
Turning back to the audit that I think you say in your statement happened in 2004, do you remember that audit?
No, I don't.
No. Do you remember how many auditors tended to show up?
It was usually two. It was usually two. I think for the first three audits, we had the same two gentlemen for the first three audits that we had. And the fourth audit, I had a security audit in between, and then I had the fourth audit that was two ladies.
How did they treat you?
Always good. They were always welcomed. You know, I had nothing to hide. You know, cup of tea and biscuits. Get on with what you want to do, and they were fine. I mean, one of the audits I was over £1,000 out. I can't remember whether it was just under 1,000 or just over 1,000 over, because they'd sent me 3 error notices that weren't mine, but I had to put them through because they were under my FAD code. So I put those through. So they wanted me to take the money out, and I said, well, no, I'm not going to take the money out because that doesn't belong to me. It goes in the tin, in the drawer, ready to go back in next week when you realise you've made those error notices incorrectly and it comes back again. So why should I take it out? I'd only be robbing myself. I'm not going to do that. So, you know, it stayed in the drawer.
And did you ever use the helpline at all?
It wasn't called the Hell Line at our office. It was called the Hell Line, not the Helpline. Quite regularly, because we had a lot of freezing of the computers, and they would we'd ring up and they'd say, "Oh, turn it off, reboot it." We get one screen go down, and then we get that back up and running, and then one of the others would go down and back up and running. After asking for details of the post office of how many times we'd rung the office, they reckon we rang once a month. Well, that's not true. We must have rung 5-6 times a week, sometimes a day if it was a particularly bad day where they kept freezing.
Do you remember the audit that took place before you were suspended?
You'll have to remind me which one that was, I'm
So
sorry.
this is the final one where I think you say in your statement the shortfall allegedly found was around 26,000.
Yeah, they came, that was some stamps. I had 700 books of 100 stamps show up on my screen that shouldn't have been there. And it's not as if we pressed a double button to say that's how many we should be in there. We'd never actually had that many delivered into the unit. So I thought, well, they're not supposed to be there. Perhaps one of the staff have tapped something, or even I may have tapped something that put them there. I need to take them out. And as soon as I took them out, that gave me a loss. And I thought, oh, God, I've done that wrong. So I went and got my counter news and went through it and did it again, and it doubled it. And I thought, well, if I ring the helpline, I haven't got this sort of money. I just haven't got that sort of money. So I tried again to get it back to the 70 stamps it should have been, 70 books rather than the 700 books that it should have been. And all of a sudden I had a loss of £36,000, which there was no way, I just didn't have that money to put in. So I made the mistake of declaring that I had that because I was scared of being suspended again and being held responsible for that money. I thought if it is something I've done wrong, then I should have an error notice back and I can put it right again as soon as it comes back. But of course, once you've done it once, the next time you want to roll over, you have to do it again. So I took out a loan and maxed out my credit cards, and I managed to raise £10,000, which I put in. And then whatever profits I could make from the shop, I was trying to put in as much as I could each week, but I just couldn't get that. I just could not get that amount down. It just, the more I put in, it just seemed to keep coming out at that amount all the time.
And was that when the auditors then came?
That happened in May, and the auditors came in, I think it was...
I think you say in your statement December.
December, I think, yeah. It was December. I'd got all my staff into individual units, and I'd kept the loss in my unit. And I hadn't told anybody about it. I hadn't even told my husband. And that weighing on you for 6 months is one hell of a pressure. And I let them do all of the staff things, and then I told them that they would find a discrepancy in mine. But I needed to go through to the house and explain to my husband first, before we did what they came to do. And I went through and explained to my husband, because he'd had to stop work because of ill health. And it was not nice. As soon as I told her that there would be a discrepancy, the smiles disappeared, and everything else was quite sharp and directed. When I came back in, she'd already rang through to the management and that to tell them that there was going to be a loss. And then it was, they actually made the loss up to 28, it was something like £28,000, but the auditor herself had counted the £10 notes incorrectly. And I actually said at the time, that's not right. And they came back the next day and recounted and brought it back down to the 26 200 and something. I can't remember exactly what it was.
And how did you feel that day?
Oh, gutted. Absolutely gutted, because I knew that a job that I loved was gone. I knew it was gone. I hadn't signed any of the cash accounts since it had happened, because I knew that they were incorrect. And there was the one auditor on one side and the one on the other side, and they stood over me until I signed them. And I didn't know at the time that I could sign them, that they were signed under duress. So as soon as I signed those, that was me done.
When were you suspended?
I was suspended that day.
I think you say in your statement you were terminated, your contract was terminated on the 2nd of January 2009.
Yes.
January. Is that about right?
Yes, that's about right, yeah.
You were then interviewed by the Post Office later in January 2009, is that right?
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about that interview?
I got an awful cold. I'd rung the Federation to see if they could, that's Federation of Sub-Postmasters, to see if they could help me. And the lady on the other end of the phone said that as I'd been suspended, I was no longer a sub-postmaster, therefore they could do nothing for me. So I rang the local area rep, which was Mark Baker. He's now with the CWU, and asked him if he could come as another sub-postmaster, because they told me I couldn't take a solicitor. I could take somebody that worked for the post office. I couldn't take a family friend. I couldn't take a solicitor. It had to be one of those two options. So Mark came with me, and he was told right at the beginning of before they cautioned me and everything, that he wasn't allowed to say anything.
Who was there from the Post Office?
2 investigators. All the way through, I was telling them I exactly what had happened and how it had happened, and they kept telling me that can't happen. Nobody else has had any of these problems. It can't happen. And I said, well, it did happen. I can't make a story up to say something that fits in with you. That is what happened. And when I got my statement through in the mediation from Second Sight, when they'd written it out, none of that was in that statement. And I thought, well, even that, they've not put in what was actually said. A lot of it was correct, but a lot of it had been missed out. They went through 2 tapes while I was there. And, it's like 4 pages of written statement. So I don't know. And I never ever got a tape or anything, so I don't know what happened to that.
How did you feel after that interview?
Well, to be honest, I was a little bit relieved, because at the end of it, they said to me they were going to go away and investigate it. And I thought, well, great, at least they're listening. They asked for all my bank details, which I gave them with no problem, because I got nothing to hide. They asked me what sort of car I was driving. I think they were a bit disappointed when I told them a 25-year-old Volvo. That where had I been on holiday? I took 1 holiday from the post office where I was relieved by somebody else, and £600 went missing, and I never had another holiday from the post office at all, because I couldn't afford to have a holiday and then have money go missing that I would have to make up. But they said they were going to investigate it, and then I waited and I waited and I waited, and then the next thing I had was a special delivery envelope, one for me and one for my husband, because both our names were on the post office property, and we'd bought a buy-to-let, which my son was making good, so that we could let that out, and that was going to be my pension, because I'd not got a pension then, and I didn't hear anything back. They never said, right, we've investigated, we found this, we found that. I absolutely heard nothing from them at all.
And at that time in your life, I think you say in your statement that after your contract was terminated, you worked for St John's Ambulance, is that right?
Yeah, I was a volunteer for St John's Ambulance for probably 4 years. During my time at the post office, I used to help out at a lot of events, and I worked my way up so that I could crew an ambulance and actually work for them for the NHS at weekends, because it was another thing that I loved to do. And as soon as I was convicted, I got a recorded letter from them to say I could no longer be a member because it was bringing them into disrepute, and would I desist from contacting any of the members.
And how did that feel?
Blooming awful, because I'd raised an awful lot of money for them.
You've mentioned your conviction. I think you say in your statement you received a summons to the Magistrates' Court for theft, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
What did you plead?
Right through magistrates, right through up until the day of the court case, I pleaded not guilty. I was called to Cirencester Court, and my barrister said, no, you'll be okay, there's no cells there. They've obviously decided you're not going to prison because you're going there. So I went up to Cirencester Court, stood outside with some of my family and some of my customers and lots of other people and policemen waiting to go in, and it didn't open. And I rang my barrister and she said, where are you? I said, I'm at Cirencester. And she said, oh no, it's been changed to Crown Court. You've got 25 minutes to get here or you'll be held in contempt. Nobody'd let me know that it was supposed to be at Gloucester. I got the letter the day after the case that it had been changed to Gloucester. So it was almost like an American movie with Burt Reynolds. We were in a convoy down from Cirencester into Cheltenham, into Gloucester. And then when I got there, the TV cameras and everything were there, and I was zombied, really. I got my keys, I got my car keys, I gave those to my dad because I didn't know whether I'd be coming out and driving home or anything like that. And then when I got in, my barrister was talking to the post office barristers who were being quite disparaging against me not turning up. And then she took me into a room and said, look, they've offered to drop the theft charge if you'll plead guilty to a false accounting charge. If you don't, you're going to go to prison, and you'll go to prison for about 3 years. And my husband was ill, and I knew if I went into prison, I wouldn't come out. I knew I wouldn't come out. So I pled guilty. And then the judge, as soon as I stood up, because he actually passed sentence that day, as soon as I stood up, he said, you're not going, this is not going to be a custodial sentence. I can see it's not, yeah, she said, I can see it's not a case of larceny, it's a case of can't remember the actual word, but something like obnoxious contract. And he sentenced me to 150 hours of community service, £1,500 costs. And all I heard was my mum and dad and my son sobbing from the gallery above. And I know I went and saw a probation officer and everything to get everything set up for, but I can't remember doing that.
You say in your statement your conviction was overturned last year.
It was.
I'm now going to ask some questions about the impact that all of this has had on you. You mentioned earlier what happened to your job at St John's Ambulance.
Yeah.
And I think this also had a financial impact on you, didn't it, as well?
I've been luckier than most. I've been able to work since my conviction. I worked for a private ambulance. Well, I worked for a private ambulance unit that worked for NHS in between the time that I was suspended and convicted. But as soon as I was convicted, obviously they won't allow you to do that with a conviction, so I had to stop that. Then a colleague of mine was opening a business and asked me to come and work with him because he'd worked with me on the ambulances. And I worked with him for about 6 months. And then I went to get a cleaning job because I just couldn't concentrate on anything. I just couldn't get my head round doing anything with any responsibility. I didn't want to do anything that handled money anymore. I didn't want to even go there. And then I went on to the dole for 3 weeks. And then I got a job as a cleaner because my husband was no longer earning then, so I was the only person bringing any money into the house. And I got a job as a cleaner, and there was an accident on the site, and the person was injured, and I assisted with him. And then the management of that company asked me to teach first aid for them, so I started doing that. And then I went and got a teaching qualification, and I went and got my NEBOSH. And the last 10 years I've worked as a health and safety consultant within aerospace. So I've been one of the lucky ones in that respect, that I've been able to work. And I've had some money coming in, so I've managed to pay off any debt that we were in, and managed to pay off the mortgage. Because I wanted every penny to go off the mortgage so that we knew that we had a roof over our head. Lost my thread now, sorry.
That's okay. I'm now going to ask you some questions about your health. What impact has all of this had on your mental health?
Huge. I went to the doctors. He gave me some medication. But it didn't stop me feeling as though I'd let my family down. And I got some tablets and a bottle of water, and I went up onto Cleve Hill. That's my thinking place. And I was going to take them. And as soon as I got up there, out of the blue, Joe Hamilton rang me and was speaking to me and saying, you know, you're not on your own. There's lots of us. And that was the first time I knew that I wasn't the only one that it had happened to, because I didn't realise there was anybody else out there that had gone through this. I had no idea. And then I realised I was back at the car, and I hadn't taken anything, I hadn't drunk anything. I thought, well, if I'm not on my own, I can do this. And the first meeting that I went to, when I got there was about 60 people in the room, and Alan Bates, thank God for Alan Bates, he's an incredible man. And Kay Havenel. She is. They're both. We owe them so much to get us to where we are now. And they asked in the room how many people had been told they were the only one, and well, the hands went up, and I just couldn't believe that they tried to separate us so much that we wouldn't understand that this was right the way through all of the post office. And it's affected my health in as much that I now have fibromyalgia, which means I've got constant pain. I walk with a stick because when my one leg cramps, I end up flat on my face, and that's to do with the fibromyalgia as well. And I've got that, according to my consultant, because of not being able to sleep. And again, that's because of the post office.
When you say you weren't able to sleep, what do you mean by that?
Just lying, looking at the... Before I knew there was anybody else, I'd just keep going over and over and over it in my head to see whether, if I could think why it had happened and where it had happened. And then I'd wake up and I'd find myself going through drawers to see if I'd put money in there. I knew I hadn't taken it, but I was looking everywhere for it. And I was lucky if I got a couple of hours sleep a night. And then it was back out on an ambulance or whatever again, with Wendy being the smiley person and looking after everybody else. And that took a toll because I boxed it off and tried to deal with it inside. And I think my body just went, nah, I'm not having that. So it means now that I've had to give up work because I can't concentrate. And health and safety is obviously quite an important thing that you have to get right. And I didn't want to make a mistake for anybody and get anything wrong. So I've given up work.
What about the impact on your family?
Huge. My mum and dad were absolutely devastated for me. I was very lucky with all of my family. Every single one of my family went, yeah, right, like you take anything. Because they know that that's not part of the way we've been brought up and the way our family worked. My dad was, you don't spit, you don't tell lies, and you don't steal anything. And that was the way we were brought up, and that's the way we've always been. And for people to think I was dishonest, for me and my family, was horrendous. I mean, it's had an impact on my husband's health. He's definitely the worse for it. Unfortunately, my father's passed away now, and he passed away before my trial was thing. And I lost my son in that period as well, one of my sons. So I only found out 4 months ago that my son started a job at a large factory, and the day he got there, somebody asked him where he was from, and he said, oh, Hatherley, and gave the address of the post office as to where he lived. And I won't use the exact expletives that were used, but they called me a lot of names where he felt that he had to defend me. And his life in that job was made so uncomfortable that and losing his brother, he had a major breakdown.
How does it make you feel knowing that he went through that?
Horrendous, because I didn't realise he was being bullied at work like that. I just didn't know. And he didn't feel that he could tell me until just before Christmas.
I think you mentioned in your statement that your story was covered in the local press. Is that right?
The day after the court case, we had to go and get some shopping, and I walked into Tesco's, and where they normally have all the different papers on the wall, instead of that, they put the local Echo all over the wall with my face on it, saying local sub-postmistress escapes jail. And my husband looked at it and he said, do you want to go? And I said, no, it'll be tomorrow's chip paper. I'm going to just carry on. And I've tried very hard to keep my head up. Every job I've gone for, anybody that I've come in contact where I've had some sort of, if I've gone in to train in a different company or anything like that, I've always made sure that management knew exactly what had happened to me, and then asked them, do you still want me to work for you? Because I didn't want, I've always been upfront and said, like, this is what's happened to me. I did not steal any money. And I've always made that, so I've always done that. But it's affected us all in horrible ways,
How did the local community treat you?
Mostly very, very supportive. I didn't know at the time, but a lot of people had written letters via a councillor, a local councillor, to the court on my behalf, which was very humbling. To know that many people supported me was lovely. I did have one man spit at me in the street, and I did get spat on when I was doing the community service as well. We were working on the canals, and as people walked over the bridge, over the canal, they would see who they could hit as we were going along there. But some of the community service I actually enjoyed, but I didn't quite enjoy the canal bit.
What would you like from the post office now?
I've got a list. My manager at the time wrote a letter to the post office supporting me. Now, his job disappeared for him 2 weeks later. Now, I don't know whether he lost his job because he wrote that or whether there was any other reason, but he was doing really well up until he tried to support me. The thing that really, from the people on the Hell line that took all the calls, from people telling them that they were short. Why didn't their moral compasses get them to move it up to the management there? And if they did, why didn't that management then move it further up the company? So we've got right from people answering calls on the Hell line, right through their management, right through the management that came out to visit post offices, up to the board. Now, they're either completely negligent in their jobs, and in that case, they should have all their bonuses and everything taken off them because they were totally negligent in what they were doing and they didn't know what was going on in the post office. And if they did know, they were complicit. And if they were complicit, I really want them to be charged to win because it's wrong. It is so wrong to do what they did to us. And if those people did hand those things up the line but were told not to do it and then were bullied into keeping quiet, we need to know that as well. We need to know why they did that. And that goes through to the government as well. The civil service that worked between BES and the post office itself, they had people on the board of the post office. If they knew, why didn't they say something? And if they knew, the postal ministers must have known through all of this time. Now, either they were completely hoodwinked and they were negligent, or again, they were complicit in what was going on. And that has to stop. And you can't leave the same people on the board and expect that post office to run correctly. It's an inbred way that they run everything now. And the last thing I'd like to say is I'm one of the lucky ones. I know after all of that you wouldn't think so, but I was one of the lucky ones. I was convicted, which means I will, at some point, get some compensation. There are other people out there that have lost everything. Now, they may not have gone before a court and be found guilty. They've still lost their homes. They've still lost their businesses. They've still lost their families. They're still in debt. They're still bankrupt. They need help from the GLO to get what they deserve. And even if it means giving them back what was taken in costs to bring this to the public notice with the GLO, they need to have that returned to them. And to be honest, that even going to cover their losses. That needs to be looked into properly. Like I say, I'll be all right because I will get compensation because I was convicted. But please, please help those are the ones that weren't convicted and still lost everything. And that's all I want to say.
Is there anything else you want to say to the chair?
No.
I'm just going to turn to the chair to ask if he has any questions for you.
No, I don't have any questions, but my heartfelt thanks to you for coming to give evidence today.
Dr. Brown. Thank you.
Well, since we're moving, I would say, slightly quicker than we might have, perhaps we will have a 5-minute break just to let everything settle down, and then we can start again, yeah? Yes, Ms. Kennedy.
Chair, our next witness is Mr. Timothy Brennan.
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
As you know, my name's Ruth Kennedy and I ask questions on behalf of the inquiry. Could you confirm your name, please?
Timothy St John Brentnell.
And I think you should have a copy of your witness statement there.
Yes.
And I think it should be dated the 11th of January 2022.
It is.
And it's 11 pages. And if you look at the last page, page 11,
Yes.
is that your signature?
Yes.
Have you read through this statement recently?
Yes.
Is it true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Apart from the one point of point 6, looking back at it, it should have been 2006, not 2005.
In late 2006?
Yes.
Thank you. Other than that correction, is it true to
Yes.
the belief? I'm going to start by asking a few introductory questions about you. How old are you now?
40.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in the village where this post office was, in Roach, in Pembrokeshire.
How many children do you have?
1.
What kind of jobs did you have before you took over a post office?
I'd had several local jobs, from a groundskeeper. I worked in the ITV digital call centre, and following the collapse of that company, I went on to work for security companies, firstly Reliance Security and then Group 4 Security.
Why did you want to work in a post office?
I didn't particularly have an aspiration to work in a post office, but being from the westest of Wales, work was or sort of permanent work was quite hard to come by, and I found the work with Group 4 was moving me further and further away from home. So when the opportunity came to purchase the shop and the post office in the village that I'd grown up in, I got together with my parents and we decided that we would buy it and it would make a lifelong career for me at home in Pembrokeshire.
I think you mentioned in your statement that it was a shop, a post office and a fish and chip shop.
Initially, yes, yeah.
And I think you say in your statement that you initially had a temporary sub-postmaster with you, is that right?
Yeah, when we bought the business, it was the outgoing owner and sub-postmaster left in a personal hurry. So we bought the premises from him, but I wasn't approved to run the post office by the post office for some 4 or 5 months after we'd bought it. So there was a temporary sub-post mistress who ran it for those initial 6 months.
I think you say in your statement you took over the role of sub-postmaster in late 2005.
Yes.
Is that right? What training did you receive?
I had 4 days on-site training.
And did you have training with the temporary sub-post mistress as well?
No, just I had a gentleman come from post office on the Monday and Tuesday of my first week. He had to go somewhere else for the Wednesday, and then he was with me again for the Thursday and Friday.
And how did you find that training? What did you think of it?
It was more training on sales and upselling post office products rather than actually running the office. He sort of, the gentleman that trained me didn't know how to account for the cash machine or the lottery that we had on site, and just said, oh, you'll have to just refer to your operations manuals and follow the instructions in those.
How did you find using Horizon?
I never really fully understood how it worked, but the trainer said to me, as long as you're, he said, you if you're honest with it, you'll never balance to 0, so there'll either be a plus or a minus figure. So you either take that out and keep it in a separate pot, or put it back in and keep it in a separate pot. But as long as you are honest, then you won't have any problems. So I didn't really, knowing that I was honest, I didn't really worry about how I was using it, because I didn't understand that what it was actually doing when you were balancing was producing accounts.
So when did you start to notice shortfalls and discrepancies?
I initially had a problem in late 2006, which is when I then had my first audit, and there was a shortfall of around £6,000, which, as far as we could tell, had come from transaction corrections to do with the lottery that wasn't being accounted for properly. But the auditor explained that it was in my contract that I was to be held or was responsible for these, so I had to pay that £6,000 back into the post office.
Did you ever use the helpline?
I did initially, but I sort of despaired with it, because you'd ring with a problem on Tuesday and you'd be told to follow these certain sequence of button presses to correct it. And sometimes it would correct it, and sometimes it seemed to make the problem double. And then you'd ring the next day and say, no, this problem seems to have doubled. And the next person that you spoke to would say, oh, well, I don't understand why you've been told to do that. That's completely wrong. You need to do this. So every time you spoke to somebody different, they gave you a different way of addressing the problem. And most of the time it seemed to make things worse.
How did you feel about that?
Well, because I knew I wasn't being dishonest, it didn't really concern me, because I thought, well, I know I'm not doing anything wrong, I'm not stealing, and eventually it will sort itself out.
In your statement, you mention a big alleged shortfall or discrepancy in 2008 of around £22,500.
Yes, that arrived as what they called transaction correction one morning, which you had to accept before you could open. Which is when that's what threw me into a panic, because I knew from my experience with the previous audit that I could be held responsible for that money. I didn't understand where it had come from or what it meant, so I just accepted it and decided that if I contacted the post office, they could well ask for that full amount immediately, which I knew I wouldn't be able to pay. So I tried to, I falsely declared that I held the cash and tried to pay the money back with the view that once I'd corrected that shortfall, I could then go and say there's been this problem, and can we find out, do I owe you the money or do you owe me that money back? Whose problem is it?
How much money did you pay back in respect of that alleged shortfall?
I'd got it down to about £16,000 shortfall before the next audit came.
And the next audit, you say in your statement, was in 2009, is that right? And I think you say that by that stage, having paid in, the alleged shortfall was about £16,500.
Yes.
How many auditors came for that
2.
audit? And what did you say to them when they arrived?
Well, it was the same lady that had been my manager, Gaynor, originally, and the lady that had done the first audit. So they were friendly. We sort of had a cup of tea and a chat, and she went through sort of her initial procedures. And then when she came to account, I took her into the back office and said, before you do the full audit, that I need to tell you what I've been doing, because you're going to discover a shortfall. At that point, I was under the impression that they would have been there to help me.
Did they help you?
No.
What happened after you told them about that shortfall?
Their attitudes completely changed. They immediately they went outside and called through to their bosses or the post office. Before they completed the audit or counted anything further, they came back in and told me I was going to be suspended while they found out exactly how much money was missing, in their words.
What happened then? I think you mentioned in your statement an investigation team arrives.
No, I didn't see an investigation team for about a week. They completed the audit. Before they left, Gaynor said to me that I was going to be contacted by both the investigation team and the post office HR manager, and she sort of said to me off record, don't tell them what you've told me, that you don't understand what's happening, because they'll accuse you of stealing it. Make sure that when you're interviewed, you can provide a reason to where this money's gone. And when you go for an interview with your HR manager, the best thing you can do is go with a cheque to pay this money back, so that they don't accuse you of theft.
How did you feel when that was said to you?
I totally lost in the moment, because I knew I hadn't stolen. There was no evidence that I'd stolen anything. I certainly wasn't living, the high life from ill-gotten gains. But I was totally panicked in the fact that I was possibly going to be accused of stealing this money.
Turning then to when the investigation team come a week afterwards, What happened then?
Well, I had a horrible experience with the investigation team. Initially, I missed a phone call from an unknown number. When I rang the number back, the investigator introduced himself as a man called Mike Wilcox and told me that he's not the kind of person that you miss a phone call from. I said, well, I don't know your number. I haven't intentionally avoided you. But that set out his attitude from the beginning. He called me in. He explained that he needed to interview me, but said, we're trying to get to the bottom of it and understand what's going on. It's just an internal procedure. We need to record it, so we'll have to do it at your local police station. But because it's an internal procedure, you don't need any legal representation. So I went without a solicitor.
Who was there when you arrived?
Mike Wilcox and a lady accompanying him, but I can't remember her name.
What happened at that interview?
They started off on the tack of accusing me of taking the money, saying, well, how do you afford to have a car? And when I explained to him the value of the car that I had, they said, okay, well, it's clearly you haven't spent it on a car. I hadn't taken any holidays or things like that. And I kept repeating to him, saying, well, I'll give you my bank statements, I can give you access to anything to show you that I haven't taken this money. Which they seemed to me at the time of the interview to accept. And then the second part of it seemed to be dealing with the balancing procedures and why I had declared on Horizon that I held this cash, and I tried to explain the position that I laid out earlier, that I was trying to repay it to avoid having the suspicion of that huge amount of me of theft because of what had happened with the previous audit.
I think you say in your statement you paid the post office for the alleged shortfall.
Yes, at my interview with my HR manager, which either happened just before or just after the investigation team, I did go with, thankfully, money that I could raise, but mostly from my parents' savings, to pay them that to avoid the theft charge.
I think you say in your statement your contract was terminated with the post office on the 4th of December 2009. Is that
Yes.
about right?
Yeah.
You then appealed that termination.
Yes, because they terminated my contract, saying that I'd been dishonest, and I appealed it on the grounds that I hadn't wanted to be dishonest. It felt like I'd been forced into that position. I wanted to have proper training on it, and I wanted to continue to run the post office. Was not just an integral part of our business, providing footfall to the shop, but it was the post office in the village that I grew up in, and I knew personally most of the customers, and that's one of the pleasures that I drew from it, was serving the local community, and I wanted to be able to continue to do that.
Who heard your appeal?
I can't pronounce her surname very well, but it's the lady that has since been in the trial, Angela van der Bogard or Bode.
How was that appeal hearing? What was it like?
Totally emotional. She listened to the reasons, as I just said, that I wanted to continue, and I felt that I hadn't done anything dishonest. And she gave me no indication on the day of how it had gone, and within a week I just received a letter saying that it had been denied.
What were you then charged with?
Charged with false accounting. That's another point, going back to the investigator. When I was charged with false accounting, my mother, who was in a previous life a maths teacher, said, well, we'll sit down and we'll go through all the paperwork that we have from the post office, and we'll try and understand if they've gone wrong or if you've gone wrong or what's actually happened. But neither of us, the documentation that we had, we couldn't, when I was a postmaster, you couldn't draw anything from Horizon to try and follow what had happened, and the stuff that I had from them at interview didn't make any sense. So we together rang Mr. Wilcox to say, do we have to now engage a solicitor to get disclosure from the post office about these amounts of money, or is there something further that you can provide to us? And he said to us, look, you've already paid back £22,500 at that office. I could make a case for a further £135,000 worth of shortfalls. If you don't stop digging, I'll come after you for the lot.
I think you say in your statement that your case for fraudulent accounting was transferred to the Crown Court.
Yes,
Right.
yeah.
What advice did you receive from your barrister about what you should plead?
Well, still at that point, I was determined that I was going to plead not guilty. But the barrister explained to me that the actions that I'd taken with the monthly balances and signing them could provide evidence that there was false accounting, and regardless of intent or not, if I stood in front of a Crown Court with a jury and pled not guilty, that the high likelihood is that a jury would believe the post office over me. So he convinced me to plead guilty to the false accounting charges, because he said if I pled not guilty and was found guilty, then I would very much likely receive a custodial sentence, and my best option was to plead guilty and hopefully have a suspended sentence, which is what happened.
How did it feel receiving that advice?
Deflating, because if a barrister, either I didn't know at the time whether he believed me or not, or whether what he said was right, that he couldn't actually provide any evidence to fight it, But knowing in myself that I hadn't stolen anything or done anything maliciously, that I was going to end up having to plead guilty to it because I didn't want to go to prison.
You mentioned the sentence you received. What was that suspended sentence? Do you remember?
It was, I think it was a number of months, but suspended for 18 months.
And you did some community service.
200 or 250 hours.
Your conviction was overturned last year, is that right?
Yes.
I'm now going to ask you some questions about the impact that all of this has had on you. You've already told us about what you paid into the post office in respect of the alleged shortfalls. What other financial consequences has this had for you?
Well, huge. When we took over the village shop, it was a nice little business. In the 5 years prior to these problems, I was there 6 days a week minimum with the post office, and probably there on the 7th day as well. I diversified the shop into several different sales areas as well, and we'd built the yearly turnover up to nearly £450,000 a year. But following my conviction, I not only lost the post office wage, but also lost any sort of drive or want to be involved with the business. And that turnover's now dwindled to less than £100,000 a year.
How are you now financially?
Stuck. We bought the business, maintain and still have the shop. There's a different. We had to fight to keep the post office counter in the shop, because without it drew in footfall from a huge rural area, and without it, we felt that the shop wouldn't continue at all. So we allowed the post office to, after I was convicted, to have another temporary sub-post mistress come in and run it. And then when the next sub-postmaster or sub-post mistress took it on, they reduced its hours hugely, which had a knock-on effect to our trade in the shop as well. But we've been stuck there now with a business that is only just washing its face, as the saying goes, unable to sell it or move on because it's not an attractive proposition to anybody else now.
I think you also mentioned in your statements that you had to sell a car, is that right?
Oh yeah, I had to sell. Initially my mum and dad paid all of the money that the post office were asking for, which wasn't in any way their fault at all. So I had to sell everything that I didn't need to try and pay them back.
Turning then to your family, what was the impact of all of this on your relationship with your parents?
Yes, they paid the money back, and they obviously believed me when I said that I hadn't taken any money. But it did then put a huge strain on the relationship, because in their opinion, could have cost them their savings, cost us all our future prospects by getting involved with this mess.
What about its impact on other relationships within your family?
Yes, I had strained every relationship. I mean, my sister was also running a hotel locally, and once people found out this had happened to me, they sort of tarred her with the same brush, that she might be untrustworthy and wasn't to be trusted. The stress and strain of the whole situation. I was married at the time, and that marriage ended shortly afterwards because, again, it caused trust issues, but also, obviously, the amount of pressure and stress I was under, it changed me as a person as well.
What impact did all of this have on your mental health?
Well, if you'd asked me, I've said this several times, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, if anyone had asked me, I would have said I dealt with it brilliantly. But when I had the news come through last year that my appeal wasn't going to be contested, I suddenly had this huge outpouring of every emotion that you can imagine, and then almost slept for 2 or 3 days. Following that, you realise, looking back, how different. You don't realise sometimes how bad you are until you start to get better, and you realise that maybe 2 hours sleep a night isn't the normal way that you should be living, and the stress and stuff that you're under.
I think you mentioned in your statement a charity that you started to volunteer with.
Yeah, I was. That started with my community service that was spent at the local Mind mental health charity, and the first day that I was there, the man that was supervising me asked me what had happened, and he believed me. I threw myself into that community service, and got a great deal of reward from helping people. It initially started at just sort of sweeping the centre and making cups of tea and helping with the cooking and things for people. But following my community service, I continued to volunteer there, and they realised, and I realised, that I was quite good in that kind of field. And eventually they offered me a part-time job, and I led therapy groups and things along those sort of lines.
Why do you think volunteering for a charity like that was so important to you?
It gave me a sense of purpose again, and the purpose that I'd lost in the community at the post office, because it wasn't just serving people stamps or sending parcels or fetching them their pensions. It was a real sort of central hub of the community, and people would come, yes, to use the post office, but they'd stay for a cup of tea, and we'd talk through people's problems, and it was a real sense of helping people.
How do you feel about yourself now?
I don't know. It's been a long time since it happened, and I can't see how I can ever get back to that excited young man that I was.
I think you mentioned in your statement as well that you lost friends over this. Is that right?
Yeah. It's a very rural community where I live. I was fortunate that when I was prosecuted and went to court, that I don't know why, but it wasn't reported in our local press. But obviously, people in the village and the community, you're there in the post office in the centre of the community one day, and the next day you've just gone. So people would talk and were trying to find out what had happened and things going on. And obviously, the rumours went round. But I'd visit the local pub and you'd hear, oh, there's the fraudster, or there's the man that stole all the old people's pensions, or things like that. So I just stopped going out, stopped sort of socialising.
How did that make you feel to hear people say things like that about you?
It was horrible. But initially, I tried to challenge some people on it and put my side of the story, but people would always come back with, well, you pled guilty. If I was accused of something like that, they'd say, then there's no way that I'd plead guilty to something I hadn't done. They couldn't understand that was just advice that I followed to avoid having to go to prison. It's horrible.
What would you like from the post office now?
I've written a little bit. I know this inquiry is called the Post Office Horizon IT inquiry, and I've watched at home most of the hearings in London. Alongside that, I've also followed the BES in select committee meetings, and last week or the week before, when there were questions asked of Paul Scully in the House of Commons. During all of those meetings and sessions, Horizon is mentioned all the time as being the main problem. It's fair to say that it's the root cause, and that problems started with Horizon, but we're here discussing the human impact, and I think the inquiry should also be looking at the human cause of these problems. Myself, as every other sub-postmaster you've heard from and probably will hear from, had problems that started with Horizon, but those problems did not finish with Horizon. Horizon merely provided the data that showed a shortfall, but it was people who chose to believe that data over myself or hundreds of other sub-postmasters. It wasn't Horizon that prosecuted us, it was the Post Office. It wasn't Horizon that encouraged us to pay back money under threat of theft charges, that was people at the Post Office. It wasn't Horizon that sacked Second Sight when they found uncomfortable truths in their reports in 2013, that was people at the Post Office. It wasn't Horizon that then went on to shred documents, that was people at the Post Office. Horizon then did not try and outspend the group litigation people, the 555 as we are known, in court as an attempt to deny us justice. That was a Post Office decision. Horizon did then not try and recuse the judge of that trial. That was a Post Office decision. Horizon did not tell hundreds, if not thousands of us, that we were the only people having problems. That is the evilest of lies, and again, that was the Post Office. And I hope this inquiry will look very closely, not only at Horizon, but the people.
Is there anything else you'd like to say to
No,
the Chair?
that's it.
Chair, do you have any questions?
No, thank you, but thanks very much for coming. It's much
Thank you.
appreciated.
Yeah.
Right. So I think we're going to move to the next phase, and for those who may not know what's happening, when these hearings opened in London 11 days ago, I think, Ms. Kennedy, I said, amongst other things, that many people would not be giving evidence, but those people had provided detailed witness statements, which were very much part of the sources of evidence that I would be looking at. It's right that those people's witness statements should be referred to publicly so that it's known that they gave those statements. And so just before lunch, when everyone's ready now, what's going to happen is that summaries of some of those witness statements are going to be read out so that the witness statements themselves and the persons who made them are publicly acknowledged as part of this inquiry. So we'll break off again for a few minutes until everyone is ready for that process to begin, and then we'll do as much of that as people think appropriate, and then break for lunch. Over to you, Ms. Patrick.
Thank you, Chair. We're first going to read the summary of the evidence of Mr. Anthony Gant. Mr. Gant is married to his current wife, and they've been married for 12 years. His wife has a daughter, and Mr. Gant has 3 children from his previous marriage. Before working with the Post Office, he was a dealer on the stock market, having taken examinations for this role. He's now a store manager for Greggs. In June 2003, Mr. Gant and his then wife decided to move to Wales, as his ex-wife was from there originally. He secured the role of sub-postmaster of the Nantua Post Office branch in Newton, Wales. He owned the property that the post office was in, and this included a small grocery shop and a residential side of the building where he and his ex-wife lived. Prior to taking over as the sub-postmaster, Mr. Gant received 1 week's training at the post office headquarters in Bury St Edmunds, and then some on-site training from the outgoing sub-postmistress to whom he was replacing. Mr. Gant noticed issues with Horizon. Initially, when he noticed those issues, he would pay any discrepancies out of his own money. He would pay this any way he could, from taking money from savings to taking money from the pub where he was the leaseholder, his retail shop, and from credit cards. However, it got to the point where he had no more money to put in. He says, "This was very distressing for me. Mr. Gant was undertaking daily cash declarations and then monthly account balances each month. During these balances, he would have to inflate the cash on hand figure to cover the discrepancies. He did this by inflating the cash declarations to reflect what he saw on the daily snapshot on the system. He thought by doing this he was making it look normal. He would then have to declare that he had the cash, even though he didn't. Mr. Gant says, "I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I was too frightened to tell anyone about it." He tried calling the helpline when errors were occurring, but he never received any support. On 19th April 2007, an audit was carried out by the Post Office, which resulted in a shortfall of £13,000 being alleged. Following the audit, Mr. Gant was suspended. He says this was devastating, and he felt sick when the auditor arrived at the branch. On 7th May 2007, he was interviewed by the Post Office investigators and was very scared at this time, and he was not legally represented. However, he had a Federation representative present during that interview. Mr. Gant was prosecuted by the Post Office after being charged with theft. He had problems sleeping, as his situation was always on his mind. He would wake up in the morning thinking about it and go to bed thinking about it. He says it was endless. Upon advice from his legal representatives, he pleaded guilty to false accounting on the basis that the charge of theft would be dropped. On 26th October 2007, he was convicted of false accounting at the Shrewsbury Magistrates Court and given a suspended sentence, ordered to undertake 100 hours of community service, and had to pay costs of £960 and compensation to the Post Office of £14,500. Mr. Gant believes that his commitment to one of his children who required medical treatment for a physical illness is why he avoided a prison sentence. Despite earning only £1,000 a month, he was ordered to make payments in the sum of £500 a month to the Post Office. This was, he says, a massive struggle for him and his family and led to him missing payments on other bills. This got him into, he says, a lot of mess financially, and it took him a number of years to get straight again. He had to return to court to reduce the payments he was required to make to the Post Office, but in the end he paid back the full £14,500. His wife was then forced to return to work on a full-time basis, despite having a young child to care for. Mr. Gant was devastated when he found out that he was being convicted, and he recalls thinking, "I don't know if I'm going to walk out of here." It was sickening. Following his conviction, he split up with his ex-wife, and his leasehold over the pub that he then held came to an end, meaning he had no source of income. Without income, he could no longer afford to pay his mortgage, so the Post Office closed his sub-post office and the property was repossessed by the lender. He lost his stock market credentials. He used to coach children's rugby and would referee matches. However, following the accusation, he made the decision to give this up. He was unable to go back because he knew he would need a clear DBS check. Mr. Gant's conviction was covered by both the national and local newspapers. One article in his local newspaper, the Shropshire Star, wrote that Mr. Gant took the money for his own gains and in order to live a lavish lifestyle. He says now, this was devastating. That newspaper has since published an article about Mr. Gant's conviction being quashed and how wonderful this is. However, the initial article about his conviction still comes up above the new article in search engines. Mr. Gant finds this really frustrating. He divorced from his ex-wife following the stresses of what happened with the Post Office, and that had had a huge impact on the decision to divorce. Mr. Gant also lost most of his friends. He had one close friend who stuck by him through it all, however, and Mr. Gant is very grateful. Despite being wary of who he makes friends with, Mr. Gant has still not lost faith in people. He says, "I think I've been helped by the fact that I've been responsible for helping to raise money for the Ronald McDonald Children's Hospital." Mr. Gant has raised around £8,000 for this charity. However, he talks about the impact of the events with the post office on his family. His children received some backlash as people would make comments in the community. His children suffered issues at school, and his younger daughter would defend Mr. Gant and give verbal abuse back. He still gets comments and sly looks to this day. It will always be with him, and there will always be people who say, "There is the guy who robbed the post office." When he decided to look into matters further and realised there were issues with shortfalls and convictions for others, and not just him, old memories started to be dug up. He was hit hard by the emotions he had been suppressing and suffered a mental breakdown. He felt so low, he felt he wanted to end his life. It was an awful experience. He feels now and wants to say to the inquiry that people can kick him as hard as they want, but he will not stay lying down. And that ends the summary
Thank you.
of Mr. Anthony Gant's evidence. I'm going to move to two summaries which will be read together now. Those are the summaries of the evidence of Mrs. Amanda Barber and Mr. Norman Barber, who were married and together experienced Horizon at the Thelwell Post Office. First, the summary of the evidence of Amanda Barber. Amanda Barber became sub-postmaster of the Thelwell branch in 2009 when she bought the business using a post office loan via Barclays Bank. She worked there with her husband Norman. Prior to that, Mrs. Barber and her husband had purchased a previous post office from her father in Lancaster. Her father ran that one before Mrs. Barber and her husband took it over. They ran that post office for approximately 3 years. In addition to that work, Mrs. Barber and her husband frequently worked for the National Register. Mrs. Barber reported issues with Horizon to the post office on a number of occasions. She says the post office wouldn't listen and said that she had to make good any shortfalls. An official audit was done on Mrs. Barber's post office on 21st June 2011. She was present at the time. Before they had even checked the balance, they had suspended Mrs. Barber and claimed to have found a shortfall. The auditors found a deficit total of £5,631.84 at the store. Mrs. Barber was asked then to attend an interview with post office officials at the Warrington sorting office. She was charged with fraud. She was told that she would likely avoid a custodial sentence if she pled guilty. At Warrington Magistrates Court, she was persuaded to plead guilty to charges of fraud in order to lessen her sentence. This was on the advice of her legal team, including that there were issues with the evidence available. On 6 June 2012, Mrs. Barber was sentenced to a 12-month community order and a requirement to complete 100 hours of unpaid community service. And she has been trying to pay back the post office. Her conviction was quashed by the Court of Appeal on 18th November 2021. Mrs. Barber, as a result of her conviction, together with her husband, were also therefore thereafter prevented from working for the National Register, which had been another source of income for them both. Mrs. Barber became depressed and anxious, and at times felt suicidal. She went to her GP to ask for help, as she didn't want to be here anymore. She was placed on antidepressants, and Mrs. Barber still takes these now. She says that she and her husband now live in a caravan due to the lesser expense, and they have done so for many years. Following the conviction, Mr. and Mrs. Barber's family stopped talking to them. Mrs. Barber pleaded guilty to avoid a custodial sentence. As such, people saw them as guilty. They also convicted Mrs. Barber's husband, even though she was the postmistress and he just helped out. Mrs. Barber and her husband had a big role in the wider community, not only within the post office and the newsagents, but they'd helped with the introduction of post offices in W.H. Smith shops. Mrs. Barber's daughter worked with them in the newsagent section of the business. She, their daughter, was deeply affected by everything that had happened, and they had to support her too. Their daughter no longer works and feels just as isolated as they do. And we'll move to the summary of the evidence of Mr. Norman Barber. Norman Barber is married to Amanda Barber, who was prosecuted by the Post Office and convicted of an offence in relation to alleged missing monies at Thelwell Post Office. Mr. Barber was not in a contractual relationship with the Post Office. In 2009, Mrs. Barber became the sub-postmaster, and Mr. Barber would occasionally help alongside his role then at Manchester Airport, where he worked on the car parks. They bought the post office with a bank loan. Prior to this, Mr. and Mrs. Barber ran a post office in Lancaster, which before them used to belong to Mrs. Barber's father. Mr. Barber was aware of shortfalls within the system for some time, but couldn't explain them, and at one point thought their staff members had been dishonest. These problems were reported to the post office, but they were told to make good any shortfall, and problems as such saw Mr. and Mrs. Barber using their own money to make up for these losses. Mr. Barber said that when they no longer could afford to put their own money in, I used inheritance money to pay back the deficits. We even took out credit cards and loans to try and clear the balances. On 21st June 2011, an audit was conducted at Thelwell Post Office and a shortfall found. Mr. Barber was aware of this shortfall, and he'd already organised somebody to buy his car the very next day to try to make it up. The auditors, he says, simply weren't interested and subpoenaed Mrs. Barber on the spot. Mr. Barber says, "We were suddenly treated like criminals. My wife's car was searched, and we were both interviewed under caution. The whole experience was degrading and frightening." Later that day, Mr. Barber recalls, an agency worker attended the post office after turning up in a sports car. Mr. Barber says that agent gloated and laughed about how he had been able to make money from these scenarios. Although Mr. Barber was not employed by the post office, he was told that he would have to attend the police station to give a statement. Initially, he tried to refuse. However, a police officer turned up at the house, and Mr. Barber was taken to the police station, where two investigators interviewed him. Mr. Barber attended Warrington Magistrates Court on 6th of June 2012 with Mrs. Barber and pleaded guilty to fraud. Both pleaded guilty after their legal representatives told them they would most likely go to prison if they didn't. Following the guilty plea, Mr. Barber received a 12-month community order and the requirement to undertake 100 hours of unpaid work. To pay the shortfall back, Mr. and Mrs. Barber had to find money from external sources. They used £50,000 of inheritance, borrowed £30,000 from family, and sold their family car. Mr. and Mrs. Barber had to sell their business at a loss, and they also had to sell their home when they could no longer pay the mortgage. Their home then took 3 years to sell. All the while, the debt they incurred was mounting. In addition to this, Mr. Barber gives evidence as to the detail of their convictions being reported in both local and national press. He says, "It felt like everyone knew who we were and what we allegedly did. It was very embarrassing for us, and as such we avoided going out as much as possible. It was humiliating as people wouldn't make eye contact with us and avoided us completely. We were very much involved in our local community and knew most of the residents. They suddenly stopped talking to us." Mr. Barber says his mental health suffered too. He says, "I became depressed and knew that this was going to financially ruin me and my wife. I put all my efforts into doing as many hours as I could at the airport, 7 days a week, and my wife and I barely saw each other." Mr. Barber says his conviction also put a strain on his relationships, including with his family. Prior to the incident, he and Mrs. Barber had a big role in the community and were well known. He said, "Following the conviction, everyone only saw us as guilty, and people just stopped talking to us. Even our family stopped speaking and seeing us. It was horrific. The only family that Mr. Barber speaks to, other than Mrs. Barber, is now their daughter. They lost contact even with close family, who he says all saw them as guilty. Their experiences also had an impact on their daughter, and she was, he says, deeply impacted by the way they were treated. And, he says, since the incident, she's never worked. He believes it's had a devastating impact on her, and it will be difficult for her to move on. Whilst Mr. and Mrs. Barber's convictions have now been overturned, he says, the experience has marked us forever." He adds, "The whole process makes me angry, and I'm still angry now, particularly as the post office apparently knew all about this and didn't prevent it from happening." He says he continues to experience these feelings, and adds, "Having strangers retelling our stories brings back these feelings all the time." And so I think that may be a convenient time to stop.
Fine. Thank you very much. So the clock in front of me is idiosyncratic, to say the least. What is the time? It's 2 minutes past 1. Okay, so we'll start again at 2 o'clock. Fine.